Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Tom Fuller, and I am the Professional Development Director for the National Association of Government Communicators. Welcome to our webinar today, Ethical Challenges for Government Communicators. I'm really excited to have Dr. Lawrence Parnell with us. We've had some spirited discussions already offline and really interested in his content, and then the ability for you to ask questions as well as we go through the webinar. So a few housekeeping items. Your audio settings can be adjusted if you are having any issues on the audio button. And then if you want to submit any questions, you can do that at any time by clicking on the Q&A button on the top panel. We'll take questions throughout, and then towards the end of the webinar, we'll moderate those, and Dr. Parnell can answer those questions. So first, a little bit about the National Association of Government Communicators. If you are not currently a member, thank you for joining us today, and our hope is that you will see enough value in the organization that you will want to join as well. We are dedicated to advocating, promoting, and recognizing excellence in government communication. We provide opportunities for professional development, career advancement, and enhancing effective communication for your constituents, and advancing the profession of government in communication. And that is our goal. The membership is open to anyone who is performing communications duties within a government entity, whether you're a public information officer, a speechwriter, a webmaster, a social media expert, or any other kind of role in communication. And we are really dedicated to providing world-class training opportunities. And I think today's webinar is an example of that. And Dr. Lawrence Parnell is an associate professor and director of the award-winning Strategic Public Relations program at the Graduate School of Political Management. And over his 30-year career, he's held a number of senior communications positions in consulting, on the client side, and in politics. Most recently, he was vice president and group leader of the corporate communications practice at Hill & Knowlton in Canada. And he came there from Barrett Gold, also in Toronto, where he was a senior vice president. He has held senior positions at GTE, People's Bank of Connecticut, Stop and Shop companies, etc. And earlier in his career, he was a speechwriter for the mayor of Atlanta. Dr. Parnell holds an MBA from the University of New Haven and a bachelor's degree in journalism from Boston University. He's a frequent author and speaker on communications topics, and really excited today to hear what he has to tell us on how to maneuver some of the ethical challenges that we face when communicating for government. And I mentioned in one of the emails that went out prior to this webinar, as soon as we put out the webinar, we already had some controversy going as far as the National or Society for Professional Journalists giving us some opinions on how they felt that the practice of government communication should change. So hopefully Dr. Parnell will be able to address those, and we'll have a spirited discussion. So Dr. Parnell, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, everybody, and welcome today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Tom has indicated, early in my career, as I like to tell my students, I used to work for a living, and that included working on the government side as a speechwriter for the mayor of Atlanta, as a public information officer for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, and a speechwriter and press aide for the Attorney General of Massachusetts. And then I went into the corporate sector and have been in that space for a while before coming to GW back in 2008. I am responsible for a master's program in strategic public relations here at the George Washington University. Our students, as you might imagine, bring a variety of backgrounds to the program. We have probably equal parts of recent undergraduates, mid-career professionals, including government communicators, career changers, often journalists getting into public relations, and international students. So it makes for a very dynamic and really exciting environment. And most of our students, I would say at least a third, when they leave our program, join government service. We have public affairs staff and communication staffers across many of the cabinet secretary departments here in Washington, D.C. and across the country in our online program, or they work for nonprofits, or they work for PR firms and corporations. So I'm around this space a lot, and we've had some ongoing conversations with the NAGC. We're excited to be part of this event today and to talk to you about the topic of ethics, which is one that Although some people may think ethics and government communications, like military intelligence, are mutually exclusive terms, they aren't. And those of us who have practiced in the government space know how important it is to do your job well and to do it with an ethical perspective all at the same time. So let me begin by walking you through what you can expect for the next 35 or so minutes, and then we'll get to the Q&A. We'll begin by defining our terms. I think it's always helpful to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we see as ethics and how it applies to communications and government service. Then I thought it might be helpful to walk through a couple of case studies that are relevant to government agencies here in Washington, both of which were conducted by alums of our program at the National Institutes of Health and U.S. Department of Agriculture. Wrap up with some best practices in terms of things you can sort of tips and takeaways, and then hear your questions and your comments about this topic. So with that as a setup, let's begin. And brief commercial. I do have a book out. We use it in our program. It's used in 30 schools across the country. We're proud of it because it's an applied approach to communications. It's not academic and dry. It's very straightforward, hands-on, and a lot of what you're going to see today, including these case studies, are in that text. So let's start with defining terms. Ethics, as we know, as communicators and as people, is a study of what is right or wrong, fair or unfair. And for us as communicators, it's a framework for making decisions about how to do our jobs. Specifically in the government space, we know from experience, and you all live this every day, you are making decisions and taking actions that impact the public and society routinely. We are in a public service role, which is different than many other communicators. You provide information, you create awareness about programs and opportunities for people, you encourage or change behavior, health, safety, etc., or you deliver public services, transportation, security, human resources, taxes, healthcare, etc. So it's a different world than the traditional communicator, and therefore one that requires some separate discussion and separate study. I've done an excerpt here from the NAGC Code of Ethics because I think that's a good place to start. And note, we've bolded the reference to the fact that providing public information is an essential civil service. Citizens have a right to equal, full, understandable, and timely facts about their government and the services that we provide and what we're doing with their tax dollars. We understand that as government communicators, but I think it's important just to point that out as we begin. So let's talk a bit about government communications from my perspective as one who did it early in my career, and I see it here every day in Washington, sometimes done well, sometimes not done so well. There's certainly examples of that around us. But there is an addition to this responsibility to communicate on behalf of an organization and its leadership. There is a duty to the public and to intermediaries on behalf of the public, whether that's media, other elected officials, other government workers, that we have a responsibility for beyond just what might be done in the private sector, where you are focused on corporate reputation, bottom line performance, product sales, etc. And when you're talking about public service, you're talking about the delivery and utilization of services that taxpayers pay for and need to understand how to use those services well, and when there's issues and challenges, what's going on and what you're going to do about it. With this responsibility, with this power as public communicators, though, we have a responsibility, like all communicators do, to be ethical and effective. Shortcuts to get something done in the long run work against you. I think we all know that from experience. So specifically digging deeper into this issue, I think that the public information officer has a unique internal and external perspective that they bring. As Tom mentioned, I started out in my career early on as a public information officer for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, which any of you who work in law enforcement or anything under the criminal justice system, you know, is a very, very challenging role because you have the rights of citizens, you have the rights of the inmates, you have the needs of the employees who work in the institution and the superintendents who manage them. There's all kinds of people there. And as the public information officer, you are in this intermediary role. You're a liaison between internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, with all kinds of people trying to get access, influence behaviors, change your funding, etc., and or legitimately know what's going on. So it's a very, very challenging role to be a public information officer. It's not a simple matter of taking orders and dishing out press releases. And anyone who thinks that doesn't really understand the function very well, in my view. We as public information officers, as government communicators, we are a link between the organization and citizens. As I mentioned before, you're a liaison between public and government, but you're also in a role where you're trying to spot trends or issues and opportunities or challenges and bring them to your management, to your leadership, to your elected officials that you're serving, so that you can deal with them just like you would in the private sector. The difference is there are political considerations, there are citizens' rights considerations, there are public access considerations that change all this. As communicators, generally, we provide ethics advice and counsel to organization when something happens. People want to know, what should we do? How should we handle this? What's the right thing to do? And hopefully they ask those questions, and hopefully they ask them of you as communicators, and you're able to give advice based on what is the right thing to do, what is the most effective thing to do, and what is the responsible thing to do. Because a successful outcome, whether it's in a crisis situation or a day-to-day part of your job, impacts the quality of life for citizens in your city, county, state, or federal government agency, and impacts the delivery of essential services to those people by others in your organization. So we are in a very important role as coordinators and disseminators of information and providing access to information that helps people get delivery of services that they are entitled to as citizens. So a very brief step aside into the academic world to give you an idea of what some of the foundations of ethics are, and have you understand that a bit. And I promise that's going to be it. It won't be on the test. There won't be no essay required about this. But I do want to give you the benefit of a little research that is out there on ethics generally and in government in particular. So there are three major types of ethics that guide us as communicators, and for that matter as people in terms of our decision making: teleological, deontological, and virtue. These are ethics that are teleological, or ethics that are values-based. Deontological are ethics that are rules-based, and virtue are ethics that tend to be virtue and practical experience-based. Now, what does that all mean? Well, when you try to apply these to government communications, and you see across the left-hand side there, the column, the three different types of ethics that I talked about, and other names for them: utilitarianism, absolutism, and agent-based. When you look at the description, it starts to answer the question, which one of these most likely applies to government communications? And if you see them, you can see how they're described, and you note their emphasis in the first one on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And the second one, you see this focus is on rules and what is morally right. And the last one is more individualized. So based on that, most of the research that I've seen and people that I've talked to who study ethics in much more detail than I do lend us to believing that teleological ethics are the most applicable because they are values-based, they are focused on doing the greatest good for the most people, and we are guided in our decision-making from an ethical perspective by established rules and duties that we have as communicators. But this comes with challenges. The challenges include, for example, you need to think through 2 steps ahead, as some people have indicated. You know, Wayne Gretzky once said, I focus on where the puck is going to be, not where the puck is now. And as communicators, we are often in that position. You need to think about the consequences of decisions and outcomes a couple of steps ahead before the decisions are at, and give advice based on that. You must weigh in that process good and bad outcomes and make an assessment of what you think has the most positive impact with the least negative consequences. And you've got to do this in real time. And you've got to do this under pressure from the public, perhaps from your leadership. This is not an easy task, but it's important because how we are judged as communicators and as people, and what kind of reputation we have as professionals is very much dependent upon how we handle ourselves in this exact situation. And this is where ethics will help you solve that and be able to live with yourself and the outcomes after the process that you find yourself in the middle of is over. So all that by way of background, what does this mean and what kind of framework might we suggest for ethical decision making? A colleague of mine, Don Wright at Boston University, describes this process very well in his text on this subject, which I believe is called How to Practice PR Ethically Without Losing Your Soul. So he's got a sense of humor about this. His name is Don Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, at Boston University. He talks about these 4 steps, which is very common in any kind of communications process, but it is important specifically from an ethical perspective. You define the issue. What is the problem, the opportunity, the challenge that's in front of you? Note the facts and other external factors, politics, economics, social, demographic, that are going to be weighing on the decision. Identify all the stakeholders. This is basic PR 101, but I would indicate to you, especially in public service, it's important for you and us as practitioners to identify your opponents as well as your supporters, because as you plan out an action, a response, a program, a launch, whatever you might be doing, you need to think about how it's going to be received by everybody, not just the people that agree with you, but the people who might disagree with you, and how you might respond to them were it to be, become a problem. Not everyone's going to think what you want to do is the best course of action, so therefore you have to really be prepared for second guesses and have answers for those. This goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about thinking a couple of steps ahead. Having identified the stakeholders and defined the issue, now you need to define and evaluate, and this is all in real time, not days, weeks, this is hours and minutes. You have to define and evaluate all the options that you see in front of you, pros and cons, what the impact might be, address the concerns of all your stakeholders and their possible reactions, and then make a decision. And you can justify this decision if you find yourself at a place where you have an option that allows you to fulfill your responsibility to the public, to your leadership, as well as something that respects your own values as a professional and does the most good, and conversely the least harm, to the public. So if you follow this framework that Don Wright puts forward, you might find yourself able to step through and make a decision without having to knee-jerk it. Situational ethics, which is what a lot of us do, we try to figure out what to do in a given situation, is short-lived and not necessarily beneficial to you. If you go through this process, which reflects the slides of a couple minutes ago, define the issue, identify the stakeholders, evaluate your options, and make your decision, you're going to have a much stronger base on which to proceed, and you're also going to feel you've done the ethical thing in a difficult situation. So let's talk about a couple of cases. I know that these are both involve alums of our program. We're quite proud of them. The first one has to do with the National Institutes of Health. We have an alum who is responsible for communications for the National Institutes of Health at their Bethesda facility, and they had to deal with the Ebola outbreak now 2014, 5 years ago. You all remember this was a case where there was an outbreak in West Africa and very much a lot of concerns about its impact on the United States, travel, et cetera, et cetera. And sure enough, an individual did come to the United States, to Dallas, from West Africa, who was in fact infected with the disease, came down with symptoms of it, needed to be treated, went to the hospital, caused a great deal of commotion and concern because it was just a routine conventional hospital, not used to dealing with these sorts of things. And unfortunately, 2 of the nurses who treated him were infected while the patient did not survive, which is not uncommon in the case of a severe case of Ebola, which he had, well developed. The concern were for the nurses who were treating him, which is their job, and yet became infected. So they required very specialized treatment for for Ebola and to be quarantined and kept from spreading it any further. And NIH was chosen to manage their care. Now they're in Dallas, and NIH is in Bethesda. So the whole process of transferring the nurses to the various hospitals, one went to Emory and one went to Bethesda, was dramatic and covered by the media in great detail. But it created a whole lot of conversation about how did this happen in Dallas in the first place? Is the US health system ready? Is NIH capable of treating these people? And you could imagine the communities of Atlanta and Dallas where they were being brought to had localized problems and concerns about their safety. In Bethesda, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., what we call inside the Beltway, is in a very upper middle class residential area. And people were concerned that right there in their neighborhood was going to be this nurse who had been infected with Ebola, and were they going to be safe? The press coverage was immense. The misinformation was a lot going on. And the NIH staff had to deal with this because they had to respect both and respond to media inquiries, which were legitimate because people were unaware and afraid, but they also had to deal with public concerns and staff at the facilities. So they had to reassure the local residents and staff. They had to manage international media and public questions. And this is where the ethical situation comes into play. They had to protect patient privacy and rights and support the families who were there to help their family members get through this difficult time. So their rights had to be respected, as well as the need for the public to know. Managing this evolving dynamic situation, you can imagine, was very, very challenging for them, but they developed a plan. They managed the crisis. They were very proactive. One of the things that they did, for example, before the nurse was transported to NIH and the facility was being made ready for her arrival, they conducted a media tour to show them this is the facility where she will be treated. You can see how the precautions that are being taken in terms of sterile facilities. And of course, when the press was walking around, it wasn't sterile, but it was finished and made sterile afterwards. But they showed them what was going to be happening once the nurse arrived. And therefore, they had footage and coverage and experts and reporters with some degree of knowledge of what was going on, because they could not give them access to the patients while she was in the facility, both for security and health reasons, but also for privacy. You couldn't turn her into a media circus when your focus is on her health and her family's well-being. So they had to manage all this, and they did this by doing things in advance and then having daily briefings and bringing out doctors who were treating her, giving updates without necessarily subjecting her or her family to press inquiries during the period of time when she was being treated. The good news is the nurses were treated and released, and they were completely cured. And there was a press event at the facility where the doctors, nurses, and staff that took care of her were recognized and thanked. The patient was now able to speak for herself because she was free of the illness, and to prove that she was safe and it was okay for her to be in the public domain, President Obama gave her a hug on camera. So there was no question that she was okay. So this was an example of a very complicated crisis situation that challenged them, but also had ethical elements to it. Patients' rights, customers and citizens' rights, and all these things had to be managed, and the right thing to do, fortunately, worked out to be the effective way to handle this. Okay, second one, you might all remember this one. This was the pink slime case. This had to do with a product that is created when ground beef is processed, and there's basically a excess that comes off that can be, through a process used by one manufacturer, can be captured and turned into beef. It's the runoff, it's the fat, it's the extra stuff that comes off in the process. And I'm not getting into a discussion about that, except to say it is and had been used for many years without any incident in school lunches, and was sold in national chains, and it was identified as lean, finely textured beef, because that's what it was. But the ABC Evening News, it was Diane Sawyer at the time, jumped on this story and created this whole notion, and someone, I'm not sure who coined this phrase of pink slime, and it exploded across traditional and social media. And USDA, which, as you might know, has a food safety inspection program, which is where our alum works as the public affairs director, was in the middle of all this because they were having to address the specifics of this case, but also defend food safety as provided by the federal government on the state, local, and national level. They had rumors, they had incomplete reporting, they had drama of people talking about, pink slime, which was really a headline-grabbing phrase. And you talk about school kids, you're talking about all the elements of a really dynamic, messy, complicated crisis. And there was another, the manufacturer of the product had a vested interest in this being successful, and they were trying to promote the safety of the product. At the same time, USDA was trying to manage and defend its procedures. So it was quite a celebrated, high-profile mess for a while. But what happened? Well, so having to navigate 3 different government agencies and a private company was very challenging. Their responsibility, ultimately, from an ethical and professional basis, was with the employees and the public who were involved in food safety, and the public who was the recipient of the work of the food safety people. And their focus then was on communicating on their behalf, not on behalf of the manufacturer, which was problematic because they were making claims that, USDA was asked to defend and discuss, but it really wasn't their area. And they had to reassure people in general about food safety. You know how these crisis situations work. If this is a problem with beef, what about pork? What about chicken? What about, cheese? I mean, is there a problem with the entire food safety process? Public concerns about this sort of thing get out of hand very quickly, and this had the makings of that if they didn't manage it well. So what did they do? Well, the outcome was they decided to not defend the product because that was not their responsibility. That was the manufacturer's responsibility. And, they could argue that it had been inspected and was safe, but people were concerned about the manufacturing process, and that was really not their area or their focus. Their focus is on citizens being reassured about food safety. So the suggestion was they said, but not to disadvantage the manufacturer, who through no fault of their own was now in the public spotlight. They offered the schools and consumers clear labeling and a choice. And people knew that it was lean, finely textured beef, or it was ground beef, because it was labeled and talked about as such, and you could buy and stock, buy for the schools and stock in grocery stores, either one. And that provided a choice. So nobody was dictating what you were going to get, nor were they saying, we're going to make you take this whether you like it or not because it's safe. Because the greater good here was to satisfy the public's concerns about food safety. As you might imagine, more people, out of lack of knowledge and doubts, chose regular ground beef, and sales for the LFTB went down dramatically. The manufacturer encountered financial difficulties, but that wasn't the USDA's problem. USDA's problem was they needed to rebuild trust in food safety inspection and to demonstrate that it was effective and responsive to the public. That was their overriding message. So, and they went through the process that I talked about before, the ethical decision-making framework, considered all the parties, considered their responses, made a decision, and then rolled that decision out to do the most good, the least harm for the primary audience for them, which was citizens and their food safety inspection staff, who were being charged with being less than professional and effective. So one other thing I think is helpful to talk about, and I've got a couple of research pieces here, and then we'll get to your Q&As, is what is the impact and what is the role of social and digital media in government communications? We all understand budgets are not the same in the public sector as they are in the private sector. Staffing is not the same. Resources are not the same, yet there are opportunities for social and digital media to help, but they must be managed well in a process, particularly in a crisis situation. So let's talk about this very briefly. We all know this across the board, but particularly in the government communications space, social media has raised the stakes because information that would normally be tested and made sure it was accurate through the government communications process gets put out regardless by somebody who's in the race to get the news out, quote unquote, the news. So it's accelerated the pace and put other players into the process that normally used to be the purview of government communicators. And so it's not optional now to have some kind of communications and disaster response in general, and to have and understand that social media has to be part of that. It is not optional anymore, and I'm sure many of you know this because you probably live this every day. And these research that I'm citing here talks about a clear need to create an online presence beyond a website. Posting a website and having press releases and even a newsroom there is one thing, but actually monitoring, to the extent you have the resource and the time to do so, what's being said on social media and correcting misinformation, post your own information out there is becoming more and more important, especially in disaster situations when there's not time, news cycle wise or otherwise, to get word out. Plus, social media also allows for incoming information. There's lots of case studies and examples of how nonprofits and disaster relief organizations are able to find citizens who need help because they've posted on Facebook or Twitter or whatever that they need something, that there's flooding or fires or lack of a resource in a given neighborhood in a given part of town, and therefore you can, more directly work with them as opposed to just trying to go block by block and hope you get everybody. So, we're beyond just having a website and needing to have more than that, if at all possible. Because this is a tool as well as a challenge for us as communicators, because you can be much more rapid and much more effective in your responses, and you can provide real-time updates on what's going on, whether it's flooding, whether it's fire, whether wildfires, whether it's any number of issues that have gone on in any number of parts of the country and around the world. Social media gives us a chance to get out there and say, we're aware of this, we're working on it, crew is being dispatched, and there's no story or there's not a story about lack of government response because you're on it, you're putting news out there. Ideally, you have the time and the resource to do this, but in a disaster situation, by pooling resources with a number of organizations, state, county, and federal, you might be able to come up with that. But let's be honest, much like the rest of our work, there is the process for conflict, a possibility for conflict. And that is that you may have almost a be there first with news challenge between the organization, FEMA, disaster relief organization at the state level, whatever you want, about putting out accurate and timely information, and journalists who want to be the first to go on the air with a story that they think is going to get ratings and get visibility and get them a profile. And they may or may not check their facts. And that's, unfortunately for us, we don't have that luxury. We got to be accurate. And some journalists will just say, okay, I saw it on Facebook, I reported it, I didn't know it wasn't true. And they are able to get away with that. But as government communicators, we can't do that. So you have this challenge, but you also have, hopefully, and this has happened in a number of examples. In this particular study, it's about a flood in South Carolina, but there's any number of examples of it where media and government agencies work together to update information, minimize rumors. There's a case study that was out a couple of years ago about how the Boston Police Department used Twitter and Instagram following the Boston Marathon bombings to put down rumors about what was going on and rumors that the assailants were on the loose in this part of town versus that part of town, and people getting very worked up. They were able to monitor, and it's a case study. You can get this on any number of places, including the the Page Society website. It was a case study competition a few years back now. But the Boston Police Department used social media to put down rumors, straighten and minimize public concern by being there fast, not waiting to tell the local TV stations for them to go on the air to report it. They went direct to the public with news and updates and reassured people. And it got to the point where the press was just quoting what the Boston Police Department was saying on Twitter, rather than trying to get somebody from the Boston Police Department to make a press statement, which may or may not have been able to do at a given time. Be that as it may, we all know that social media reports are not always credible or accurate, and they can be agnostic to the facts and the truth. And there are people who are looking to foster concern and create havoc and fear, and they will use inaccurate information for their own agenda. That's got to be monitored and responded to as well. And to the extent that you see that as communicators, and you see press that you work with on a regular basis getting enticed by that, you need to point out to them where things are not true or not well-founded, and encourage them not to buy into that, just to be the first one to go on the air with the news, which may not be accurate. And that's a challenge. I recognize that. That's part of the game. So there are problems from an ethics perspective with this, just to consider, and that is that not everybody has access to technology. So you cannot rely solely on social media to put the word out, because there are people that, either for age or demographic purposes, or the so-called digital divide, or whatever other factors you want to consider, or service is down because there's no power and there's no charging and there's no access, etc. So you cannot rely solely on social media to get information out there. You must use what the authors call a multi-channel strategy to deliver information to the public: traditional media, social media, one-on-one if necessary, to make sure that accurate and timely information is being disseminated. And throughout this process, we as communicators are responsible, as I mentioned earlier, for approaching this with the best ethical framework in terms of access to people who have a point of view and things to say, to help people know what's going on, making sure information is accurate, making sure that all parties' interests are represented, not just select people, because all the citizens are our constituents, not just the ones that maybe make the most noise. And so we as communicators, it falls to us to make these decisions in the heat of the moment and be responsive, be accurate, and be thoughtful about what we do and how we communicate, regardless of the stakes that are out there. It's a tall order, but it's one that with thought in advance and research we're able to do, because that's what we do as communicators, and we're the best persons for that role, in my opinion, based on my experience and my research. So I promised that I would be short. I hope I have been. I want to give you some sort of best practices to think about, some takeaways that you need to sort of think about as you go about your day-to-day, whether it's a crisis or a routine, whether it's online or traditional media, and how to make sure you are conducting yourself in an ethical way. And that is, you first must be rational. You must get multiple information sources and different points of view, not just the one who's screaming the loudest. You must be consistent. That means specifically as it relates to your organization, the guidelines of your organization, the area of responsibility, and not beyond that, and not short of that. You must be principled that anything you do in hindsight will be viewed as responsive and sensitive and appropriate to all cultures, all demographics, all members of the public who are depending on your agency for help, routinely or in a crisis situation. And this means respecting other views, as I mentioned before, even if for no other reason than to make sure that you are prepared. You have to consider all points of view on an issue, and be aware of their concerns and their point of view, and at a minimum be prepared to respond, but also think through, maybe they have a point and we can consider this as we make a decision on how to manage this problem or opportunity that's in front of us. All the tools should be available and used by you. Internal communications cannot be overlooked in a public service environment where the individual citizen may not interact with you as a government communicator, but interacts with a line person, a staff person, a front desk person. If they don't know what's going on, don't know what to do with the question, don't know how to answer it or who to send them to, that is a failure. You don't want to have your employees in a position, your colleagues in a position where they say, I don't know, they don't tell me anything, call this number. That's not a good message. It does not inspire confidence in the government agency that you represent. So it's important that you focus internal as well as external. And ultimately, if you do what you should do, not just what you could do, you're going to be better off than if you try to, wing it and hope for the best. And let me just end by suggesting to you, and then we'll get to your questions, that by considering ethics when you make PR decisions, not only do you advance the organization that you represent and its interests, but you enhance the value of public relations counsel within it. Your colleagues, hopefully, over time will say this person is thoughtful and considerate and aware and capable of making decisions that reflect the best of what we need to do, because as Dr. Bowen indicates here, good ethics is good business for everyone if it's done right. So it's all easy to say this stuff and talk about it. I know in the real world, things happen and you have to make decisions on the fly, but I'm hoping this is a framework for you to think about as you go forward in your day-to-day lives as government communicators. And that is the end of my information. And this is how to get in touch with me. I didn't leave my phone number there. I apologize. I'll update that. But you can certainly reach me by my email or Twitter or anything else. So I think with that, we'll take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Parnell. That's great. And I do notice that we've have our first question up already. I don't know if you can see those, but Dr. Parnell, but the question is, what do you believe are the pitfalls that lead to bad ethical decisions? Where do people fail? What are the most common failure points?
I would say, as we talked about briefly, I think it's not thinking through the consequences of, and I'll think if I can do this right, I can actually, yeah, there I am. Hi, everybody. I think it really is a matter of not considering all points of view and everybody who's involved, not just the people making the most noise, and not just your boss, not just somebody else. And our job as communicators in general is to be, in this role of sort of watching what's going on in the world and bringing ideas and challenges to the organization before they blow up. This is classic issues management. From an ethical perspective, it's the same thing. If you jump into a situation and get tunnel vision in trying to solve it and don't think about all the parties that are involved in the issue, you may find yourself falling short and having to go back and fix something that didn't go particularly well. I hope that answers your question.
Great. And I've got one also that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and that is this idea that was raised to us from the Society of Professional Journalists that
Yes.
There's this tendency or trend to have only sort of control the message. We only have an official truth, and that journalists are being kept away from agency leaders and they just to talk to the communications person. Can you talk a little bit about that from an ethical point of view?
Well, yeah, I think that's a real problem. I mean, having spent some time in the public sector and have a lot of students who work in the public sector now, I realize this comes up all the time. And that's especially true these days. You see a lot of companies or organizations that will send out a written response, an emailed response, for example, or they'll only let the reporters talk with the public information officer and nobody else directly involved in a given situation. I understand that's a safe strategy. I understand that may be driven by legal counsel or by political considerations. But in my own experience, I think that to the extent that you can make subject matter experts within your organization beyond yourself, and let's be honest, as communicators, we have lots of expertise, but it may not be in the intricacies, in your case, Tom, of all the transportation infrastructure challenges that are in the state of Oregon. There may well be someone else inside your organization, the senior enough level with a purview to answer questions that you might feel is a good person to do that. Now, you have to make sure that person is prepared. You have to make sure that person understands how things work with the press, etc. But I think it can work in your favor if the citizens see that there are not just a bunch of bureaucrats and a public information officer standing in front of them, but there are subject matter experts, very knowledgeable, committed public servants working on whatever the issue is, traffic control, etc., that they're concerned about. And hearing from someone who does that and knows that, and seeing them interacting with a trusted reporter is going to pay dividends for you more than just saying, this is an emailed statement about what we're doing about a bridge collapse, God forbid, or something like that. So to the extent that you can make these experts available, not only is it more effective, but it's the right thing to do from the point of view of your citizens and from your public service responsibilities, in my opinion.
Thank you. Very good. Very good. So we have the next question is kind of related, really. We hear from colleagues there's a great pressure from political appointees to withhold otherwise releasable information and to not respond to inquiries from quote unquote blacklisted journalists. How does the ethical government communicator navigate such stormy waters?
Well, that's the real world. I mean, we certainly see that here in Washington, and a lot of my students end up in roles, and I interact and chat with them all the time. As you know, there are political appointees who come and go, who may have little to no knowledge about the department that they have been put in charge of. Even, unfortunately, political appointees who get put in charge of public affairs at a given organization. And there's a staff of people that are knowledgeable communicators. I have, for example, without naming any names, but the Homeland Security, which is in the news a little bit these days, as those organizations, the Department of State, Department of Transportation, have political appointees who are overseeing public affairs and communications, but the day-to-day work of public affairs and communications is happening at the staff civil servant level, who are going to be there after this administration goes and when the next one comes. So the ethical problem, the argument you have to make in that situation is, is that blacklisting a journalist, unless that person is completely irrational, totally unreliable, and has been shown to be such, is not a good practice. It's going to become a story in and of itself. And number one, it's going to hamper your ability to do your job. More importantly, that very dangerously gets into censorship and gets into, we're only going to talk to people we consider to be friendly to our point of view. That's not the way it works in a democracy. It's not the way it works in public service. It may be a lonely voice to be expressing that, but I think as a professional communicator, we have to say, if our argument is sound and our point of view is solid, then we should be able to interact and discuss it with the people who don't agree with us and not necessarily just want them to be our echo chamber. But that's a hard thing to sell to someone whose loyalties lie elsewhere than the organization that they may be responsible for. So it is a very challenging thing. But from an ethical perspective, you have to live with yourself, and you have to be there after that political appointee is gone. And how are you going to do that if you are not able to do your job in a way that you think is appropriate and fair and ethical?
All right, thank you again, Doctor. We've got just a few minutes left here, but there's a question that came through from Andrew Stacy. How do you ethically manage a non-trusted journalist or another party that is not, they are not acting ethically? And I think that's one of the things that we face, this whole idea of blacklisted journalists. And so two things I was going to bring up. One is in Oregon anyway, there's a very strong public information law. So unless things are specifically exempted, they are actually legally public records. So we have that as communicators to stand behind, and I don't know how other states do that. But for the blacklisted, and generally we only have that term if somebody is, a journalist is acting unethically. And for us, it just means we're more careful with who that person talks to and what they say, because we've had history of them purposely trying to twist a staff member who's not used to being interviewed by journalists.
Right.
To help. But talk to us from an ethical perspective about that.
Sure. Well, I think that's a real challenge in both the private and the public sector. First of all, you be very careful when people hear you talking about blacklisted, because that sounds like censorship, and I know that's not what you mean, but it can backfire. I think that if you have a strong point of view and you have a procedure for making people available to the public and to journalists who act on behalf of the public to get information about whatever is going on at your agency, and that person has in the past played it pretty straight, maybe criticized you, maybe given airtime to someone else who doesn't like what you do or don't do, but the reporters played it pretty straight, and that person you have no reason not to consider that person for future inquiries and media coverage. I think if to the extent that you have made it a practice and it's publicly known among journalists that you are available and open for professional, balanced journalists to bring inquiries to you, and you will make people available to them who will answer their questions in a professional and expert way, then when someone doesn't play by the rules that you've indicated you have for your access to these people, then you're in a position to say, you created a problem last time, you misrepresented yourself, legitimately, not just you misquoted me, but I mean something serious. Then you have the grounds on which to say to them, you know what, we're not going to give you access to the commissioner, to the vice counsel, to the chairman, to the director of transportation, whatever your organization might be, because you have not shown yourself to be reliable or professional. If you act in a professional manner, we will treat you in a professional manner. If you don't, then you are reserved the right to talk to somebody else. And that's fair, but if you have to have made that clear, and then you're able to fall back on that and say, you see, we're working with Channel 6, but not with Channel 2, because Channel 2 has created a problem for us and not listened. And so in a way, what you're saying is you reward good behavior and fair and balanced reporting, and you just don't engage. I wouldn't say punish, I wouldn't say blacklist, you just don't engage with those that are not acting in a way that you think is fair or balanced. That has to be, though, a fair and honest assessment that you make as a professional communicator, not just what somebody tells you because they don't like the editorial board of this TV station or this newspaper or whoever owns it. Here in Washington, you hear a lot about the Washington Post or the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. You can't write off a whole publication, but you can say certain reporters have not respected deadlines, not respected off the record, not respected embargoes, not respected attribution that you've agreed upon. So you don't feel obligated to work with them, but you will be happy to work with the people who do play by the rules, which are fair and open to everybody, not exclusive. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, hopefully so. I think that's a great answer. And it's the difference between not liking what the reporter is saying, it might be very negative toward the agency, and that's okay,
right,
versus not being honest
right,
in their interactions. And
right.
so
if
the
they
next question,
misrepresent themselves or they come in with a different agenda and you've given them access to your principal and they go down a different path, and you say, wait a second, this is not what we agreed to talk about. And so, within your rights to terminate the interview and say, we're not going to engage with you because you tell us what you want and we'll tell you whether or not, we're able to help you. But coming in under false pretenses to get access is unprofessional. And there's nothing wrong with holding them to the same standards that you would expect to be held to yourself.
So we're probably down to our maybe final one or two questions.
Yeah.
And this one's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We deal with this at the Department of Transportation with different police departments across our state, but this person's from a municipality,
mm-hmm.
and they have an uncooperative police department during even just regular crime stories, much less major incidents, where their impulse is to really stonewall the media. No information whatsoever.
Right.
How, as a PIO representing the municipality, how do you maneuver that?
Well, as you mentioned, I worked for the city of Atlanta, and I worked in a criminal justice system, so I'm very much aware of the predisposition of certain elected officials and definitely law enforcement people to not want to engage with the media, either because they're convinced that they're all out to get them or whatever the reason might be. But I think that what you have to be able to say, and hopefully they'll listen, sometimes it's after the fact. If they don't want to engage, if you go to your principal and you say, there's an increase in this type of crime in this neighborhood, and this reporter is doing a story about it, we can either not talk about it, but it's a fact, it is what it is, or we can talk about we're aware of it and here's what we're going to do about it, and we'd like the public's help in whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's neighborhood watch systems or whatever you might want to be talking about. And you're going to get more benefit out of that than you're going to be able to say, we're not talking to the press about the increase in burglaries in the north side of town because they're just going to make us look bad. And then the people on the north side of town are going to say they don't care about us. So that's not helpful to your cause if you're trying to generate community goodwill and support for police departments, to not talk to the agents, so to speak, of the citizens, which are the media, bringing legitimate questions to you. If you do, in fact, and you may find yourself having to advise an approach, be shut down, and I've had this happen to me, for your request or your recommendations, and then see the story go in a different way, and you almost want to go back in a polite way and say, remember what I told you? Well, that's what happened. Now, can we talk about how to fix this the next time? Instead of just grinning and bearing it, you almost have to go back and say, police chief, what you didn't allow us to do the last time backfired on us. Would you be open to other ideas that might be better? They certainly can't be any worse than having them all be convinced that police don't care about people on the north side of town. So you almost have to get through a couple of these things, have a painful experience, politely point that out from a sort of mini case study perspective, and then move on. And I've had that in the private sector as well as the public sector. And it can be a career limiting move. I recognize that. But ultimately, you have to do what you think is right. And what's more important, the paycheck or your reputation? And that's what it comes down to sometimes.
And just throwing my 2 cents in as a former television reporter, we would also have that problem. And in this case, it was really the district attorney of the county that was putting such pressure on the police not to say anything, because they were concerned that anything that was said would perhaps endanger the case. Right. And so one strategy you could employ is having the mayor and city manager get together with the police chief and the district attorney and talk, and maybe with your city attorney or Department of Justice or whatever you might have, to talk about what are the legal things that we can actually say, and kind of come to a sort of an agreement, and you as the communications professional can bring that perspective of people have a right to know certain things, they have a legal right to know certain things, but it's also helpful from a public safety standpoint for the public to know certain things. So you can kind of almost come to a bit of an agreement.
And sometimes what you do is you get away from the ground level and get up to 10,000 feet and sort of talk generally about the issue that the specific case brings to bear, and then you're not violating or limiting or impacting the DA's goals of winning his case or her case, but you're also responding to the public about the general issue of home invasion or whatever it is that people are concerned about, but not engaging at all may help the DA win his case, but in the court of public opinion, you're going to lose.
Right. Well, Dr. Parnell, thank you so very much for joining us today. This has been a great discussion.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for
great help. And this our webinar is being recorded, so it will be available on the NAGC website.
Yeah.
And you can get that, download it, or look at it later on. And we really appreciate all of your participation. It's been a great discussion, and we will hopefully see you next month for our next webinar Wednesday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to seeing you guys when you come to Washington for your annual conference.
Good deal. Thank you.
Take care. Bye, everybody.